Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. So today we're going to be talking about some tips for giving an effective presentation. So the first thing I need to point out is that we're going to be breaking this up into kind of three main chunks today. So the first thing I need to point out is that when I do this, I'm going to first start by starting off where it would be very natural, getting started. So we're going to talk about how, for example, you might think about preparing your presentation, but in addition, what kind of tools. So after I do that, I'm going to talk about some tools, and then I'm going to move into talking about tips for delivery of your presentation. So a lot of the last part will be about how you might present your talk and what kind of tips I can give you for preparing the visuals for your talk. So you're going to see that this is going to kind of cover a wide swath of things. So I'm going to hope that this is going to give a nice high-level treatment of this topic, but I'm happy to answer any questions as we're going along. Okay, everybody? So let's get on this. So I thought I would get started by just getting started. So the first thing I really need to tell you about is that, sure, when we pick a topic that we want to give an accurate or effective presentation on, the big thing is we not only do we have to understand the topic, but it goes another step forward than just that. You also have to be able to find a way to communicate it to others. And an effective presentation is capable of doing that translation process. Even if it isn't perfect, it's capable of doing this. So it's not just about, hey, look, I could do this great talk and I know my topic very well, but if you can't communicate to others, the presentation may as well be useless, right? So when it comes to preparing your talk, there's a few things I really want to kind of hammer in, and these are tips that I can give you based on the way I prepare talks. And I think that these are generally some helpful ways to think about it. So I'm going to give a couple of options or suggestions for how you might go about this. So the first one is that imagine you actually have a research paper that you want to give your talk about. Now, if you have such a thing, your presentation will be much more natural to transition into a presentation. Now, if that is the case, normally you're going to actually have it broken down already into natural categories for a presentation. So a common structure for such a talk would be having an introduction or an outline, but also a motivation, which I'll talk more about motivations as we go along. Then you have a problem statement somewhere in there, whether it be about, say, an application, whether it be like a very concrete problem you can define to somebody, whether it be a research statement, like, oh, we're interested in doing X, Y, and Z. This is our experiment. This is what we're going to do. Then you're going to have your results, so you can tell us about your results. Say if it's something experimental, you could talk about those results. If it's theoretical, maybe you might show a couple theorems, maybe explain one proof. You're going to see that when you do stuff like this, when you're presenting the results and talking about these other categories, you're going to find that there's going to be sort of a trade-off that happens, is depth versus breadth. So it depends on how much you want to talk about versus how deep do you want to go about with very specific things. For some talks, it makes sense to have kind of like this balanced approach where I almost like to look at it like you're just having a nice big supper where, say, for example, you may have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but there's some core part of your dish that you want to have. So usually in that kind of setting, you would you'd have a breadth of things you're going to talk about, but you'll only focus in really on one thing. Usually I find that tends to be the sweet spot when it comes to talks like these research talks. However, sometimes your presentation or contribution that you would like to talk about, or say some work that somebody else has done, sometimes it really makes a lot of sense to actually go in depth maybe once or twice, but not have as much breadth to it. So for example, say you wanted to talk about a given algorithm, just one algorithm that was in a paper. So first you'd obviously introduce what the paper is about, then you would talk about the algorithm, then you would start going to the formal aspects of why that is a thing that you would be interested in looking at, what theorems make this thing work, maybe show one proof, and then give maybe an example. So just to give a flavor for what you might do, if it's experimental, you may have it where you may have 3 different experiments you did in your study or your paper, And you maybe instead of talking about all three of them, maybe you focus only on one of them, but you'll talk about maybe at a much more shallow level the other two. It's always actually an opportunity that you can always ask like after the fact and say, hey, like if you want to talk about it after here, I'm happy to talk about those specific things. Say, for example, it's also an invitation too. Say if somebody found those other experiments interesting, they maybe maybe I'll ask them a question about it afterwards, like maybe I want a little bit more about it, or it's a good way of breaking ice with somebody after the talk. Say, for example, somebody thought that work was interesting and they want to learn more, so maybe they want to work with you in the future. So this is something more of like a research-oriented motivation. Now, if this is just so you would have your results discussion, so this might be things such as your results. Okay, you should be able to hear me now. Can you hear me right now? Now, my audio may not be as crisp as before, but you should be able to hear me just fine, right? Okay, great. It's because, so this actually comes to, I'm just going to be honest, I did this kind of deliberately, just to show you that sometimes when we're giving a presentation, sometimes things happen, which I was hoping it was going to happen actually later here. It sort of happened a little earlier than I was anticipating. I'm not even kidding. I was setting this up for later. So, like I tell you, as we're going to tell you in a little bit, unexpected things can happen during talks. So, anyways, back to what I was talking about. What we were talking about was the structure of a research talk, whether it be, say, now I was talking more of like a survey talk. So remember, the big thing is just breaking it down into core kind of categories or parts. So what I usually recommend to do is brainstorm. So take out a piece of paper, for example. If you have all of your sections, look at it and say, okay, which parts are the most important things for me to talk about? And what do I want to get across? Because there's two different really things. Like say, for example, if this was a research paper or a survey, which things are the most important that I could communicate to others about what I learned? So it isn't just simply, oh, well, this is everything that I learned about versus what can I effectively communicate to others that I learned about? Those are actually two different things. So sometimes you may not have enough time to actually achieve both of them. Instead, you may have to focus only on one. Like I mentioned, this whole breadth versus depth approach. So one big technique I usually suggest for doing this, and I do this with all my talks, is get a piece of paper out and think about how you can motivate your audience to easily digest or listen to the material that you would like to talk about. In particular, break it into the categories. So if you have a research paper, it's much easier to break it down because normally you have sections that are like these I have on this slide. But if you're doing something more based on section by section, like a part, this will work too. Just keep in mind that you may have it more about a topic by topic by topic, where maybe the outline of your talk might have a much bigger role before you start getting into each specific section. But yeah, my big thing, brainstorm. Make sure you brainstorm. I was hoping this was going to cut out later. So anyways, next I want to talk about kind of tools for preparation for your presentation. Now, the big thing that you need to know about is that it's not just like, okay, there's the idea that we just communicate ideas to others, but at the same time, we also have this whole thing where suppose that I want to talk to you about something, and sometimes it's a little difficult to just say it, or there may not be enough time for me to write it on a board or something. This is where something like a presentation tool, such as slides or slide management system or a document, is useful for communicating ideas in a very short manner. But it's a tool. That's one thing I really want to hammer in. So these are used often to aid your discussion. So there's a couple that are very common types of software for kind of the computer science kind of audience for when we think about what we can use to make presentations. Now, remember, I'm going to get to this a little later. Just remember that these are visual aids to help your presentation along. So they're just parts of your presentation. It is not just the presentation, which I'll talk more about that in a bit. But there's two main kinds that you'll run into. is what we call the what you see is what you get kind of software. Hence that funny acronym that's on the slide. That's a little wacky tobacco, right? Like that's a little bit wild there. But that's what it stands for. Is what you see is what you get. So this is your things like Microsoft PowerPoint. There's also Google Slides. These are a couple of options. The paradigm behind these two examples is that the presentation is organized by what we call slides, and you can go from slide to slide via a presentation to a visualization. So the reason why I call it what you see is what you get, because you can drag and drop pictures or figures, text, and so on directly into this canvas, for which that gets presented as a slide that goes into your presentation. So some have often more experience with that. The other option also is what we call Beamer. So this is with LaTeX. Now, how many of you have never used LaTeX before? I have a feeling that there's some familiarity with LaTeX out there. But yeah, no. So the great thing about LaTeX Beamer, so for those that aren't acquainted with LaTeX is a documentation preparation system, just like when we talk about Microsoft Word, but you would find it's very it's a markup based type of language. So the thing is, it isn't just simply what you see is what you get, it's actually that you literally could encode all of your document in one place, and you compile the document based on a language that is dictated around LaTeX. But there's a lot of inroads to that I'm not going to focus so much on here. I thought I would include as a meta example for you that on my slide here, you actually see the LaTeX code for the actual slide that we're literally looking at. Without the picture, of course, and the bottom part. I thought that would be a little bit of a fun thing to throw in here. But yeah, so you can see that the paradigm with LaTeX Beamer is at first, there's sort of the one requirement, is it uses LaTeX. So for those that are doing a lot of technical writing, whether it be papers, conference papers, journal papers, just reports in general, you might have some familiarity with LaTeX. Beamer is built around the idea of having frames, and these operate like we talked about as a moment ago as slides, just like the slide you're seeing right now on the screen. So it's built all around the idea of a frame. And if you ever need to create a new slide, you begin a frame and then you can end a frame, and whatever's between those tags, as you see in this picture here. It's kind of a little small there, so after I would encourage you to take a look at this. I posted this on the course website. You can actually see how you can make slides one after the other. Each one you can have your own attributes for them, such as the font size, or if you want to have a different title. There's a lot of flexibility for how these frames can be used. But here's the great part. So you'll find that there's templates and documentation for LaTeX Beamer actually on the course website. In fact, if it is of curiosity to everybody here, just let me know in the chat. If you would like to see the actual source code that was used to make this presentation slide set that you're actually looking at right now, I can make that available to you as well. I already have these slides up there, but I can also make this available. It's actually using the exact same template as the one that is provided to you. You're welcome to use it. If you want to make your own template, be my guest. I'm happy to take a look at that too. But yeah, you can use PowerPoint, you can use Beamer. I encourage you to use Beamer because it has a lot more flexibility, and you'll find that if you're doing a lot of technical writing anyways, you'll find that Beamer is a very natural thing to do because you can just bring over your figures and anything that you've prepared for a document like a paper. But the big caveat with that is that you still have to refine it. Just drag and dropping paragraphs is not good enough. You have to still refine it, as we're going to talk about. So are there any questions about these two? Just generally these two types of tools? But yeah, one thing I also wanted to mention while you're thinking about that is that if you find yourself looking for ways that you can play around with LaTeX, a couple of them, probably the most common one, other than just straight up using a command line with a LaTeX package, is if you're using, say a Windows system or another one. MikTeX is a very common way to use LaTeX. So if you don't have LaTeX on your system, you can install MikTeX. There's install focused versions. There's also a portable version. So if you want to throw it on a USB drive, you want to bring it with you somewhere. There's several versions of this MikTeX, which also comes with its own built-in text editor. That's actually where I got this screenshot from. Another one that also exists, I know that's getting actually a lot more popular these days. I remember when I first heard about it, is another one called Overleaf. So Overleaf is another example here. This one is actually all web-based. So what you can do is you can actually have it where you can have collaborators. So you can actually have live editing. If you're familiar with, like, say, Google Drive and, say, Google Docs, where you have live editing at the same time, this Overleaf actually supports this, which is really nice if you're working with collaborators. But yeah, you can play around with LaTeX documents over Overleaf. And Overleaf actually has a lot of tutorials on the web as well. Even if you don't want to use Overleaf, Overleaf is a great website, has lots of resources. They have lots of resources on a lot of things you can do in LaTeX. My general rule of thumb is that if you're not sure what you could do with LaTeX, just type in what you would like to do in LaTeX into a search engine. You're likely to find a tutorial about it or somebody trying to do that themselves. That's usually just getting your hands dirty and playing around with it is usually the best way to go when you're first starting to learn this stuff. Like I said, there's a template available on the course website. If you read the comments, which comments are actually denoted with percentages like this. If you see these, that means it comments out those lines. Just read those instructions carefully. Just start at the top and work your way down. It gives you some advice for how you might structure the document. And some of them are actually preset instructions that fill into appropriate spots. But yeah, no, so those are some examples. Are there any questions before we proceed? I thought I'd keep it a little higher level just because I thought I would let you get your hands dirty with it. But I'm most certainly going to talk much more about how you might prepare these slides and how you might deliver the presentation itself. Are we doing all good? Give me 2 thumbs up if we're all good. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Wonderful. So let's proceed then. I'm going to move on to what I would argue is these are Dan's tips for giving an effective presentation. So let's focus in on the delivery of your presentation. So remember that, and this is something that even, I'm not kidding, there are people out there that give serious talks on topics. And sometimes it's always forgotten that slides are a tool, just like any other media you may use in a presentation. So remember, and I write this at the bottom of the slide just to emphasize this. And I hope that you'll come out, if you can do anything to get out of this presentation, is remember that it's your presentation. The slides are not your presentation. So remember, the presentation is what you bring together with the slides if you're using slides, which I imagine you will be for this because that's a pretty natural way to organize one of these kind of presentations. Hence why we're looking for those this term. But yeah, so remember, there's more to the presentation than what's on the slide. So don't feel compelled that your slide has to have everything on it. You can always verbalize what you might want to supplement for a given slide. So for example, if I give you a slide and it has gazillions of things on it, as I'm going to mention in a little bit, you might find it very distracting to somebody looking at your slides while you're giving a talk. So usually trying to keep as few things on your slides, unless you absolutely need it, is rather helpful. When you're giving a presentation, you have to be mindful of the fact that you're trying to communicate to others, right? So a very natural human thing that is a thing that exists, as much as we may or may not like it, is that people often connect through eye contact. So be mindful of the fact that people, when they talk to you, like if I'm looking up here, or if I'm looking over here, or I'm looking over here, the way I might deliver the talk, and even the cadence of my talk, meaning the pacing of the talk, or for example, the pitch I talk, or down I talk, these kind of things change how you might engage with your audience. So keep in mind, if you're not making eye contact with them, a very common mistake that is made, and often usually people read it very quickly, is that if you're just straight up, like say for example, you have the presentation just like, I don't know, right here, it's right here, it's right about here. But imagine it was literally right here. And I'm just sitting there and I'm just like, I'm looking down over here and I'm looking at the people there staring at each other. And I'm just reading this and I say, maintain eye contact. And I'm just here just going through each one of them like this. Somebody will look at this very quickly and say, Maybe, unless it's something that they're walking through with me directly, maybe the aid isn't so much being helpful, it's actually hindering the presentation. Unless, of course, this is something that I want to emphasize. So sometimes doing things like this, where you're focusing in on the slide itself, sometimes it's helpful for emphasis, but remember, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be an aid that's supposed to help you communicate the ideas. So if you're not maintaining eye contact with your audience, they'll read this very quickly and say, this person probably doesn't know what they're talking about, or they didn't practice, or something like that. May not necessarily be true at all, just be frank, but the biggest thing is just, if you maintain eye contact with your audience, people pick up on this very quickly. Even if you're not sure and you need to take a good glance at your slides, that's okay, but you got to make it a bit more natural. For example, if I like as you might notice, I don't have any notes in front of me. It's because I know how to do this and I've done it for a long time. But even then, if I was unsure how my presentation would go, I would include a paper copy here if I need to take a quick glance at what might be sitting behind me. In fact, or if you need to, just take a quick glance just to remind yourself of what slide you're on, but make it very natural if you're doing this. So you notice how I'm talking to you right now? Now, one thing that I'm not telling you is that I actually am looking at my slide right now. It's right about there, but I'm doing it right now. But you didn't notice me doing it probably for the last minute, right? It's because I don't just stare at one thing. Normally, naturally, people look towards their audience. Sometimes, obviously, don't stare at somebody for like 30 minutes. It makes people very uncomfortable, but you get what I mean when I'm talking about. There's a very natural human element when you're giving a presentation. People can read the energy that's coming from you. So when I mean that, the enthusiasm, the fact that you're actually, like, say, the posture even, like the way you present yourself to somebody, a lot of these things can help make your presentation a little bit more than just the slides that are on the board. Hopefully that's clear, everybody. So these are just some general tips. Another thing, and this is another thing I'll mention, is make sure you speak loud enough. So I know you can hear me just fine here, but like, say if I talk like this and I talk like this over and over again, and this is my slide over here and I just talk like this, you might be able to hear me. Oh, actually, I'm raising my voice now, but before there, it was a little bit harder to hear me, but maybe you can hear me still a little bit because I'm kind of loud like that. You have to be mindful of this. You have to make sure you speak loud enough for your audience. So if you're in a very large room, if you don't have a microphone or anything on you that is connected to a mic system, and you say if you naturally have a quieter voice, it might be the case that you may have to just like project your voice a little bit more. So one thing that I can give as a tip, this is actually a tip that also I spend a lot of years like working with different kind of educators. In particular, one of my favorites that I worked with is an entertainer. He used to juggle well, I think he still juggles chainsaws. But a tip he always gave me is don't, like, when you talk, don't just straight up do it from the throat. Make sure you have some air in your chest if you need to project your voice. Then it's less work. You don't have to use straight up strain your voice. Instead, you could just, like, if you take a breath in, make sure you regulate your breathing when it comes to this. You don't actually ever have to worry about straining your voice. Just bring it in, and then you can keep talking. And then you could project your voice without having to, say, strain it by basically pulling it in, almost like a vacuum. So hopefully you find a lot of these things a little bit helpful. Another thing is also the modulation, or just general, like I said, cadence of your voice. So as you might notice, I'm a rather quirky talker. I say a lot of very funny things up here sometimes. And also at the same time, I may say some things that are just really strange. But that's just a part of how I present to people. But most certainly in a professional setting, I couldn't get away with saying a lot of these things without some matter of trust from my audience. So often something like with what I do, it makes a big deal to make a joke or an icebreaker so that people get an idea of how the speaker is like. But another thing is obviously the cadence or modulation of your voice can make or break an entire talk. Even if you have a wonderful talk and you have a very interesting subject, if I talk like this all 20 minutes, I don't know if anybody will find it very interesting. If I talk like this This right here is a computer mouse. Is this very interesting if I talk like that for 20 minutes? Like, could you handle me talking like, okay, maybe not, I don't know, but you would probably not, it would not be as exciting as the way maybe I'm talking right now, where you can tell I'm engaging directly with you about what I'm saying. Now, obviously, you don't have to speak the exact same way. You can have the same kind of monotone approach. But even then, when you exert your energy out when you're giving your presentation, say if you even have a monotone voice, I mean, some would argue that when I'm not talking like this, I have a pretty monotone voice sometimes. I don't even know what my real voice is anymore. It's kind of sad. But like if I had a voice like I am just talking at the moment, instead just simply just even pacing the talk. If say if you're an individual that has more of a like a less modular voice when it's just very monotone, just even pacing it. So being clever, adding jokes in, or even just simply making it more personal, as in just, you know how when I talked about my mouse there, I was like, this is my mouse, and so on. Rather than talking at the same exact beat every time, maybe talk a little faster, then a little slower, then a little faster, then a little slower. Something that makes sure that there is a little bit of this going on during your talk, but not too much. You don't want it to go off the rails, right? You don't want to have to rush your talk by the end. The other thing is, of course, personalizing your content. I can't remember off the top of my head. But either way, the main point I'm getting at is that sometimes people remember the things that make your talk your specific talk, if you understand what I mean. So, for example, you know how I talked about slides are a tool? Some people use other kinds of visual aids for presentations. So sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's inappropriate. You have to think very carefully about the topic at hand. So, for example, if I was giving a presentation about, I don't know, say combinatorial optimization, unless it really made sense as an analogy or something, I wouldn't grab, say, this lovely large family-sized box of Cinnamon Toast Crunch and say, woohoo, this is Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I wouldn't do this in the middle of a talk, probably, because people would not understand why I'm bringing this up. So normally things like physical props and that, normally they make natural to have with analogies. Analogies, by the way, if you're not familiar with this as a helpful tool, is when you make a comparison between two things that have effectively a logical coherence between the two that are easy to relate to. So, for example, someone like me very often uses things like this when I teach. But in a research setting, when you only have so much time to give a presentation, it is kind of risky doing things like this. But if you can manage to pull it off effectively, whether it be with your slides, whether it be a joke, or something like that, it takes your presentation to something that somebody will actually remember afterwards. And I don't mean that even, I've given talks that I'm not the most proud of because they didn't come out the way I was hoping. I've also given talks that people just loved it, and I don't know why. This is something you get kind of used to. But yeah, personalize your content a little bit. So it adds a little bit so somebody comes after your talk and can say, I remember that talk. That's the talk that had X, Y, and Z in it. I remember that. Whether it be using a metaphor, a prop, or something. Of course, you never have to do this kind of stuff, but most certainly some people find this very engaging. And the slides are actually a medium that you can do this with. So, for example, a visual aid or anything like that is very helpful, whether it be just a little bit something that makes the presentation a bit of you and not just what's there. I think that sometimes it connects a little better, but that's just my view about it. But just remember, eye contact, modulate your voice, just keep in mind that like when you're giving a talk, somebody else is listening to you. And the hardest part when you're giving a talk is, of course, trying to convince other people to keep listening to you. And if you're not doing it effectively, they're just going to shut off and they'll just wait till your talk's over. As rude as it sounds, it does happen. Like if they just can't engage with the material that you're doing. This is actually why I brought up the idea of motivation. So I thought I would start with that and talk about my first actual tip, because I've sort of kind of been working myself through a bunch of things. My first real tip is know your audience. So for our class, it is that you can assume that your classmates, so fellow graduate students, fellow senior undergrad students, you are the audience of your presentation. But keep in mind that your presentation will also be something that other people might attend. But the general audience for you is just generally somebody with a CS background. So, for example, there's some things you can get away with never having to define formally because people understand what you're talking about. For example, you wouldn't need to define what an array is. You might not need to know, like, okay, so I have to like formally define what a graph is. You might, if you need to use a key phrase like a graph G or something like that, of course, that's something that you would write down in the slide, but you don't need to teach the audience about what a graph is. You don't have to teach them what an array is. You don't have to teach them what a linked list is. They will know what a binary search tree is. They'll know what a tree is. These are things that they'll be familiar with. That's something that is good to know about your audience. And depending on your audience, that will change quite dramatically how you might structure your presentation and how, based on how much time you have. So, for example, an academic conference, you might have a lot more technical expertise to provide to people because they'll be familiar. So especially if it's a conference in your area that you're interested in, they'll be familiar with a lot of the techniques that maybe you are as well. So they might not need to tell you, hey, look, this is my key presentation on X, Y, and Z, and this is an algorithm, that's an algorithm, this is an algorithm. They might know about the first two algorithms, but not the third one. So just as an example, I'm interested in combinatorial optimization. So if I were to start talking about Dijkstra's algorithm, I never have to teach them what Dijkstra is. They know what Dijkstra is. That's a common algorithm, even for a computer science background, but it's a classic combinatorial optimization problem. So this wouldn't be something I would need to talk to my research community about because they know what that is. Unless it's specifically about that algorithm and what specifically we need to target about it if, say, that's a subject. In contrast, senior undergrad or grad course, it's perfectly acceptable to define terms, even if you know that some people in your audience are familiar with it. So usually it's a good idea to give formal definitions, just a little bit, so enough that they'll understand what you're talking about. You don't want to lose your audience at the first part of it because they won't be able to stick with the rest of your talk. In contrast, if we're talking about a daycare, perhaps my analogy with the Cinnamon Toast Crunch, this might be a little bit more appropriate if I was trying to do an analogy about packing things into bins, and I used the cereal box to talk about packing things into a box. So something like that might be more appropriate in that kind of setting if you want to talk at a daycare. But either way, hey, look, I try to push the bar with this kind of stuff. But I know that for some settings, that's not appropriate. So be mindful about how you might use text. For example, other things such as equations, figures, and of course, any charts that you have. So for example, at an academic conference, you might use a lot more pictures and figures. And if you have definitions, you may have some equations that are associated. You might use a lot of that. In a graduate talk, maybe a course or a talk at that level, you might have a little bit more text giving more definitions, some figures, of course, lots of pictures. But most certainly you wouldn't need to go into everything at the most deepest level because your audience will understand some of the basics about what you're talking about. But if you're ever not sure, just my usual rule of thumb is if I'm really unsure if they'll know about this, just put it in. Usually it doesn't hurt unless it eats up your time. That's the only time you really should make that serious call for yourself. At least that's my thoughts about it. But for example, I have this lovely Santa Claus in the slides. Maybe not the most appropriate for the subject at hand, but that's most certainly the look I get when I start thinking about my presentation. One other thing I need to point out about when you're preparing slides is be mindful of the fact that that if you use figures from other papers or something that doesn't belong to you, like it's something that you didn't make yourself, I usually recommend that you make an attribution to that picture. So have a hyperlink to where it is or who's the author of that figure somewhere, or at least acknowledge it at the end of the presentation. So like even on the final slide, just so it's acknowledged that this isn't like your picture. Some people get very finicky about copyright. This picture is actually public domain, so I didn't have to attribute it. But I just think it's sometimes helpful to have some attribution if you need to do something like that. Or you can just reserve it for the end. Just simply have a hyperlink to where you got it. But yeah, any questions about knowing your audience? Don't be shy. Okay, so let's proceed. Just a couple more tips. The second one is keep it so that you might know this term. It's called the KISS principle. The acronym KISS stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. So make slides readable, but as simple as you can, as I said earlier. Remember, if you have a lot on a slide, like this one, this slide that you're looking at is actually kind of busy. Like there's plenty going on here. So if you're looking at this slide here, you might say, okay, Dan, there's actually quite a bit going on here. But you'll notice that I split it up into a couple of compartments to make it a little easier to parse. So that when I'm going through these main points, that it's a little easier to follow what I'm talking about. So if there's too much going on your slides, remember, the people are reading your slides. They may not be directly telling you this when you read their faces, but they might be. So you want to avoid having this happen too much, otherwise they may not be listening to you at all and you might lose track of them. Another thing is that animations and transitions can be useful, but at the same, you have to also keep in mind that, like I said, these are all tools you can use to improve your presentation. Don't cluster or keep too much of this going in if it doesn't help your presentation. A very simple presentation without fancy transitions or animations, if it doesn't need it, maybe don't do it. You can easily just convey something in about 5 seconds. Just go for that as opposed to having to go through having a slide just jammed full of everything. If you just say it in 5 seconds, there's no difference. In fact, it's easier to do it that way. Couple other things, avoid clutter. So you'll notice that even this slide that has several bullet points on it, notice that I split it up into a couple parts to make it easier to parse and it's not as cluttered. Likewise, another thing that you might try to force upon yourself is the font size. One way you can force yourself not to put too much on a slide is you increase the font size. This is actually a common technique to avoid having this happen, and it also helps people that are visually impaired to read your slides, say if they forgot their glasses or something. So keep in mind that a couple things that you really want to keep in mind when you design slides, if you're choosing to use slides. Again, an effective presentation doesn't require slides, but obviously for us, we're using slides because just of the medium that we're using. So remember, effective, short, catchy headings for your slides can go a far way. For a slide, just try to stick on to one topic. Don't put too much all on one slide. It will confuse people, especially if you're kind of taking them on for a little trip to get to your main point. If you can use pictures, I encourage you to use pictures, but not too many just on one slide. Use effective visuals. If you did say an experiment that has a very effective chart that you can show them to show your outcomes, that's a perfect thing to put on a slide rather than you showing a table with a bunch of raw data on it. A chart like that will go much further in a presentation than the raw data. But you can always include that, say, as a supplementary slide, or if you want to show it to them, maybe show it to them briefly as you're talking about the setup, and then show them the actual results as a chart. But one thing I got to warn you about is that when you pick a chart type, be mindful of the kind of data you're playing around with. So for example, if you have many categories and it's a little bit hard to parse it all, maybe use a bar chart or a column chart. If you have multi-dimensional data, you might use a plot that has multiple dimensions. One thing to watch out for is if you have multiple categories and they're not measured by ratios or percentages, a pie chart can be a little misleading to people. So unless you actually have something that's percentages related, maybe avoid a pie chart. Also, I can't remember the exact citation for this, but some people have difficulties perceiving things from angles as opposed to straight categories with straight lines. I can't remember the exact source for that one, though, unfortunately. At least offhand at the moment. Again, be prepared. Technical things can happen. So you notice how I was able to quickly fix up my mic? So I quickly did that right away, right? So these are things that I want you to keep in mind if they ever happen during your presentation. So for example, say in the case that, say you couldn't access the file for read your slides, so to get your slides so you can present them to people, bring an extra copy of your slides on a flash drive or something like that so you can plug it into the computer. That's always a good idea. If all fails, print out your slides so you actually have them in front of you so you can at least present the talk, even if you don't have all of the aids for your talk. So of course, Don't show up late to your own talk. It usually doesn't go very well. People are like, what? Like, we're just waiting for this to start. What's going on? Other things, constraints. Don't be late. Don't go overtime for your talk. Keep in mind the pacing you want to have for your talk. Usually a minute per slide is pretty good. Especially if you have something like 18 to 20 minutes, having 18 to 20 slides, that would make it much more appropriate, but I encourage you to aim a little lower if possible. Practice, of course. Make sure you're familiar with the topic at hand. People will ask you questions about this stuff, and you only have so much time to answer them. So you got to manage carefully how you answer their questions, or if you would like to hold off till the question period at the end. So if somebody asks you a very specific, narrow question, you can always tell them that we can talk about it after the talk itself during the question period if you think it takes a little too long to answer it. Often in some places we'll just often keep the questions until the end. In case either way, we have to be mindful of the amount of time we have. So just if you find your presentation is too long, just start removing slides and see if it can trim it down. So if there's something that you don't have to talk about, just get rid of it. Remember, keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple. And just the last thing I wanted to talk about is just a general timeline, just to give us a feel for what's going on here. So just a big thing, just to kind of wrap this up. So I've already sent out the feedback for everybody's abstracts and talks. First, I was very pleased with them. I thought they were great. So I gave you some suggestions for how to tidy them up a little bit. So just send me an email or a message over your courses with your revised version. That way we have a copy for both of us of the final version of it in case we want to advertise it to the department. Likewise, you will also have to submit your presentation slides within about 1 to 2 weeks before your presentation. I recommend doing it 2 weeks before so that I can give you some feedback. But also, you'll be doing this as a video, so you can almost look at this like a dry run of your presentation so I can give you feedback about it. And again, you can schedule your talk. This will actually be available. It's actually available right now. Let me know if you can see it or if there's any issues afterwards. And I'm hoping that you'll find a time that's appropriate. There's going to be 2 time blocks set up for each one of the days starting August 1st, and they'll run until the 15th. And whenever we have a talk on a day, you'll be required to attend. So you'll be recording your attendance on your courses, and you'll be required over the entire span of the time to ask question for 3 different talks. So mind the limitations. So remember 18 to 20 minutes for your talk, and you'll have about at most 5 minutes to give for question period. One other thing I also have to point out is that there's also this checklist that's on your courses as well. So make sure you please complete that checklist as well as this presentation video that I would like you to put together. There should be a space there if you want to record it, upload it as an unlisted video on YouTube, for example. You can also do that. I think that's probably one of the easier ways to record yourself. If you need any help with any tech to do this, just reach out to me. I'm very happy to do so. In fact, the tools that I'm using right now are actually very easy to do this kind of stuff. It's actually also free as well. If you ever find yourself wanting to try and play around with some screen recording software. But yeah, that's everything I have to say. I want to say good luck with preparing your presentation. Hopefully you found some of this kind of fun, and have yourself a beautiful day.